And now it is really going. So can I do a quick official welcome one more time, David? 2 seconds. So we're on our People with Purpose call, and if you're listening to the recording, today is February 15th. And I've got David O'Brien with me, leadership expert, consultant, coach, speaker, keynote, event cornerstone, and author of the Navigator's Handbook. And you can certainly look into more about David at workchoicesolutions.com. So there's no LLC in the website, is there, David?
No, that's correct, Jill. Thank you. It's workchoicesolutions.com, and I'll hopefully at the end mention a few more. There are a bunch of free resources there, all committed to leadership learning. But I want to thank you again for having me on the call, and I guess we've had a few more people join us, so let me extend that thanks to each of you that are on the call participating, listening in. Thank you for taking the time to do this. That was a very kind introduction, Jill. I thank you for that. But I think there's one other thing I think that would really capture Dave O'Brien in many ways in terms of what I do and why I'm on the call today, and that is largely that I'm a student of leadership. Yes, I've written a book. I've written many articles that have been published in a variety of publications over the years, but most importantly, I think of my role as a student of leadership, and over the last 25 or 30 years, I've devoted a lot of my time to understanding what separates great leaders from average leaders or mediocre leaders. And over the last 12 years since launching Work Choice Solutions, I've devoted all of my time to pursuing that, and that has allowed me to have conversations with leaders and teams all over the world. And I'm happy to report that after spending the last 12 years dedicated entirely to that, I still have not figured it all out, but I am getting closer, and I remain a very passionate learner relative to that. So hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that today.
Yes, we absolutely will. And thanks for pointing that out. Because that is so critical. A lot of people in our business can do a lot to kind of research and write and reach milestones, but it's different to be continuing that as a learning process and just being a continual learner. So
it's a huge source of joy for me.
Yes.
And learning, of course.
That's what always makes it unique. I'm gonna go off our trail for 1 second before we get into the topic, and I know we have good stuff to cover, and I want to make sure we cover a lot of the nuances and insights around leadership lessons from this past year you've seen, and things coming up in the coming year, what people can really put on their radar. But I always do like to ask our speakers. I didn't even tell you this, David. So this is going to be like catching you off guard, but I know you won't be caught off guard. I like to ask my guests to just give me just a minute or two on, how they've been called to the work they're doing. And you're just the perfect person to ask this question of, because you exude passion and enthusiasm for your work at every angle. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, I think you know that about yourself, but it certainly comes across. Tell me just a little bit about how this work you're doing with leaders and your current work is so different and so on point for you in terms of your own purpose.
That's a great question, Jill, and I think it goes back to a discovery or realization I had a number of years ago, maybe now 25 or 30 years ago, where I realized that I was going to work for a living like everyone else I knew. I'd be spending a long time on this path called work, and I began by thinking about it in the context of realizing that, okay, I understand that I need to work for a real long time. I maybe have to work 30 or 40 or 50 years. I don't want it to be considered work. I want to find meaning in it. I want to have fun with it. I don't mind working 50, 60, 70 hours a week. Sometimes my travel schedule is such where it's 4 days a week, it's 15 days a month. Sometimes it's less, fortunately. But needless to say, I had this belief or realization that it doesn't have to be considered work. It should be a joyful thing. And the more clarity I had around what created that joy for me and what was my purpose and what were my core values, the greater time I invested in understanding that and exploring that. And I continue to do that. It's a very big part of what I do, both personally and professionally. I began to realize that it was within reach. And so for me, it was that first realization 25 or 30 years ago in a practical or pragmatic way, realizing that I had to work for a really long time, but that I really did have the capacity to find meaning in my work and have purpose in it. And I spent a whole lot of time thinking that through and trusting in it. I think for me, a big part of it is beyond having a number of wonderful mentors and people in my life that believed in me or saw something in me that helped bring that out, that encouraged me, inspired me. I've also had a deep faith that allows me to trust in that I'm always at the exact place that I'm supposed to be at any given moment, and trusting in that, having faith in that, and just continuing to show up and do the right thing for the right reasons. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's not. It's really very much the work that I do, and it's what I see in the leaders, that I learn from every single day. That's a real big part of it.
Yeah, that's where you get the biggest charge, isn't it?
Yeah, I really do, and because I get to learn. I've been a student of this for so long, and there's learning. I do quite a bit of training, largely leadership oriented, but also with teams. And every single one that I do, and I had 2 last week in different locations, different industries, and I said to both of them, like I do in every group, I come here to share my experiences with you and some stories. I do a lot of storytelling, of course. We all have a story, and we all have great stories to share, but I also make it very clear that I come to learn from them as well, and I think being open to that, and I think that everybody on the call can relate to that and understand the value of that, being open to the lessons that we can gain from people in our lives in all different walks of life, including in our leadership journey is an important guidepost for us, for me too, of course.
Yes, that makes so much sense. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'd love to jump into some of the things that I've shared with people that we will be diving into today. So kind of shifting gears on you a second.
Yeah.
I reordered some of the information you gave me because I just, in my brain, started getting so curious. One of the things I wanted to touch on first was some of the things that you're seeing. We're going through so much flux and so much change in work and the world of work and industry right now. Some of the things you've seen from this past year being among, so many groups of leadership, major and important leadership lessons that you've seen from this past year. I guess we're saying really 2011.
Yeah, and it's a great question. Thank you for asking. As a beginning point, one of the things that I'm seeing on a universal scale, because I have been doing work around the world, and specifically the thing that continues to show up, and it's something that I have a keen ear for. What am I hearing? What am I seeing? What are the common denominators? Are there universal truths to this? And as a beginning point, one of the things that I see as a universal issue around leadership and the workplace realities is that we live in very uncertain times. There's an awful lot of ambiguity out there. There's anxiety around there, the global economy, what's happening in Greece of late and other parts of the world. And what does it translate to in terms of the workplace? What does it translate to in terms of leadership? I think it's best summed up. There's a wonderful quote. I use a lot of quotes in my work because they make us think. It gives us something to talk about. It gives us a framework for dialogue. And one that stands out is a quote by Napoleon, who once said that true leaders are dispensers of hope. And the correlation to what I'm seeing in terms of these universal truths is that employees are hungry for hope. They want to belong. They want to believe in the future of the organization. They want to believe that the leader has, their best interest at heart and in mind, that they're taking them in the right direction. And so as a kind of a baseline part of the story that I've been sharing with leaders in my speaking work and in coaching and training is that your employees are hungry for hope. And it's our role as leaders to inspire that. And we can't inspire that unless we're clear on it ourselves. And it brings me to another good point. I guess one of the biggest lessons that I had in 2011, which I guess at some level, I'm glad I discovered it when I did. I guess maybe I wish I had discovered it 20 years ago, but that is probably the most powerful lesson is that leadership has nothing to do with my job title. Viewing leadership in the context of my job title, I've come to believe is very one-dimensional and limiting in many ways. But rather, I think leadership is a choice that we make. It's a state of mind. It's really about a choice. And I think that's driven by the fact that every single one of us on the call today are presented with countless opportunities every single day to be role models. And I think in many ways, leadership is about being a role model, a positive role model. But along those same lines, another key that I believe is very true that supports the hope part and the inspiring community amongst workers is really best summed up in the word congruence. And it's part, in fact, I'm going to invite everyone to please take a look on my website at workchoicesolutions.com. Under Learning Resources, you will be able to access a whole range of leadership assessments and articles, including my latest article. I do a quarterly article, and the latest article is The 3 Critical Dimensions of Emotional Intelligence, and it was just released today. That is on there, and I talk a little bit about it there, and there's also some slides from a recent presentation I did where I talk about this whole idea of congruence, and congruence very simply is a perfect alignment between my words and my actions. While I think that it's important for us as leaders to remember, the huge power of our influence, it's also very important to realize that one of the ways we're building trust, which is another critical dimension of leadership success, I think it always has been, but especially in these uncertain times, congruence really is what influences that in a big way. So, basically walking the talk. I think that's a really big one. And also the fact, beyond being a role model and leader 24/7, seeing it beyond the context of my job title, I also have come to believe that in choosing to view it that way, back to that state of mind reference, it allows me as an individual to recognize more of my true capacity, more of my true potential. I joke around with some folks and clients that I have a choice to be a leader at the checkout counter at the grocery store. I can demonstrate leadership. I can demonstrate my core values. I can be respectful. I can listen, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are just some of the things that continue that were great lessons for me. I think the biggest one, frankly, back to the original point, is that I'm a leader 24/7, and everyone on this call is, and it's a choice that we make every single day. And in living that and believing that, I believe we bring out the leadership in other people, because I've believed for a really long time that every single person that's ever worked for me is really smart. Some of them are brilliant, much more intelligent than I am, but at the as a real baseline, a part of the goal of a leader is to bring that out in people and bring out the best in people. And I think that in many ways that's another good frame of reference. Leadership, the greatest gift, I talk about this in the book, the greatest gift of the leadership path is the opportunity that we have to bring out the good in people, to bring out the skills, the talents, their true calling, and that's a really powerful gift that needs to be honored. I try to honor every day.
Yes. It's really, Chris, I relate a lot to what you're saying and get it, and I think when the rubber meets the road, what you said just a moment ago about leaders role modeling, these core values in leadership and walking their talk and to bring this out in their own, people in their own team. I just don't know what you see with some leaders right now, but since people are so hungry for some reinforcement and the hope that you're talking about, I see that all over too. I totally see what you're saying with the executives I coach or professionals I coach. I'm finding that some of the work we're doing is helping them be aware that they have to get out of the mire themselves, because some of these leaders are feeling so insecure themselves.
Oh, sure.
So it's not just it's they've become very siloed in what they're navigating and what they're dealing with, that it's just that much more difficult to remember that how they're showing up at work every day, even though what they're dealing with is so heavy sometimes or so concerning or so in flux, that if they can come out of themselves a little bit, they have to be there for the people that they're working with too. And when they do that, it actually can be uplifting for them.
Sure. And you just inspired me to think of another one of my favorite quotes. Albert Schweitzer once said that example is not the main thing in influencing others, it's the only thing. And so the correlation to that point is that our influence is huge. And while I acknowledge, in fact, there's a reference to that in the new article that just came out today, The 3 Critical Dimensions of EI in 2012, the truth of the matter is those experiences that you're referencing and being mired in the in the toxic stuff as well. It's part of the human condition. It's normal. I actually referenced that in the article, that much of these stressors, much of these issues are normal. They're okay. They're not going to go away. But because of the huge scope of our influence, we need to be constantly mindful of that. And back to the earlier point you made, it starts with our own self-awareness. You know, the theme of our call today, our talk today, is the soul of leadership, and it really comes from, as I mentioned, over the last 12 years since launching Work Choice Solutions back in 2000, I've invested a huge amount of time in trying to understand what separates great leaders from all the rest. And what I've come to believe through that experience on that journey are these common denominators that consistently show up with really effective leaders. And at the beginning of it is self-awareness. It's that clarity, it's that deliberate awareness, that deliberate investment of time and energy around getting clear on how am I showing up, what are my core values, what is my purpose behind this, and building that into living it. And here's the congruence connection. The next part of that is our behavior and how we're behaving and how we're using our influence. And I would invite the folks on the call, on the website under on the navigator bar under services, there's a drop-down, of course, and the very last one is the complete soul of leadership model. It's a great visual with some good descriptors. I invite you to take a look at that, and you'll see the continuum that I just referenced. But it goes back to acknowledging that it starts with us. And again, I can't emphasize enough the truth or reality that it has nothing to do with what our job title is. It is a choice. I make a choice every day to show up and try to be the leader that I'm capable of being, the person that I'm capable of being in all of my roles. And I think it might be worth sharing. I get similar reactions from folks, Jill, around, yes, I know these things to be true, but we live in a world that's full of distractions. And I am no different from that. I experienced that as well. And some years ago, as I was working through this soul of leadership model and thinking about the whole cycle of it and what does it mean to me in my world, I began to realize that, yes, there are lots of distractions in my life every single day, no different from what the rest of us on the call are experiencing. And so I became curious about how would I stay more grounded? How could I stay more connected to these beliefs, these values, this core of the soul of leadership model? And I decided that I needed to be more aware of it and mindful of it. And so every single day for the last 3 or 4 years, I make a point of doing what I call my compass calibration, tied to the book, The Navigator's Handbook. And it's taking the time every single morning without fail 7 days a week to invest 15 minutes or so to think through what do these things mean to me today? What do I stand for? How do I want to show up? What are the behaviors that demonstrate the Dave O'Brien that I really am and am capable of being, and more importantly, I want to be? And taking that time and using those anchors throughout the day to help me stay more frequently or spend more time on this navigator's path, which in a very simple way is about consistently having that congruence thing show up and living in that space. And
so what's number 3, Dave? We've got like self-awareness and behavior. What's number 3?
So number 3 is within the model, it's the purpose. And so out of that self-awareness, out of those values, out of that clarity becomes the purpose. And through that purpose, and I think that's a big part of my compass calibration every morning. Part of that is understanding my purpose. And so without having that self-awareness, without being deliberate about taking the time to explore this and being okay with not having all the answers, by the way. I haven't figured this out. I've been doing it for a long time. I'm perfectly okay with saying I haven't figured it out yet. But I'm hopeful that I have another 20 or 30 years to work on it. Maybe then, just maybe, you can call me the guru. In the meantime, I just want to be called the student of leadership.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes complete sense. So can I shift gears? We're kind of looking at some of the key themes that you were seeing from last year. Are you seeing different drivers for leadership success in this coming year, like things we need to really make sure we're keeping on the radar to be distinguishing ourselves as really effective leaders in the coming year?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think it's the congruence, it's the self-awareness, but it's also self-regulation.
It's all that emotional intelligence.
Yeah,
right?
it's all. Yeah, I think that's the whole story. In fact, in this article, the new article that came out today, the 3 critical dimensions of emotional intelligence, I believe, in 2012 are self-awareness, self-regulation, and empathy. And empathy begins with respect, and empathy draws that out. That's a good trust builder. There are multiple dimensions of emotional intelligence. Self-awareness, motivation, acceptance of diversity, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are, of course, very important. But I think of the 7 or 8 within the context of conventional thinking, those are the 3 that really stand out. So it's that self-awareness, self-regulation, and empathy. And the self-regulation part is, and this is, again, applies to all of us in every one of the roles that we play. We're all dealing with stress. That's a big issue. That's a front burner issue that I'm seeing in almost every organization that I'm working in or people that I'm talking to. The pace of change is accelerating. People are consistently doing more with less. And as a result, that drives a whole lot of stress in the organization. And leaders, back to that Albert Schweitzer quote, need to be very mindful of the fact of how we're using our influence and how we're managing those negative experiences. And that comes through, of course, as a beginning point, self-awareness, but also the self-regulation. If I'm not handling my stress well, if I'm not handling the organizational change well, and am not consistently demonstrating the desired behaviors, I am eroding the team's, my credibility with the team and the trust that I need to have the team engaged, et cetera, et cetera. So I think those are key parts of it. People want to believe, they want to be hopeful. Change is not going away; it's only getting faster. And clear and consistent communication from the leader, the whole leadership team, for that matter, is a critical part of it.
I agree with you, and I think that it's just spontaneously the kinds of things I'm seeing over and over again when I'm working with people. Just hone right in on the emotional intelligence piece, and even more specifically, I think you hit it right on, because the issues that people are having the greatest trouble with have to do a lot with self-regulation and empathy. They're very, very tied together. But more than anything, I'm seeing people kind of mix on the self-awareness, but I'm finding people fall down the greatest on the regulation, and I think it is because of the stress. Yeah. And they just haven't learned. It's learnable. That's the good news, right? I mean, it's learnable.
Yeah. There's a bunch of things that we can do. And to that point, I have been doing a stress management class for a long time with a bunch of different clients, and I've modified it, and I rolled out a new version of it last fall. And the thing that I'm continually struck by, and I've done it now maybe, 15 times since October when I rolled out the new version, and what I'm struck by, amongst other things, is that people have a range of things that they currently do that are helping them to cope with it. Despite the fact that, we're all doing more with less and the change is accelerating, et cetera, and stress is at an all-time high. In fact, in some circles, it's viewed as at an epidemic level. Right. The truth of the matter is that we all have things that we do in our toolkit, so to speak, from our own perspective, our own experiences, that allow us to navigate that change and that stress. And one of the things that I continually I'm struck by in this work is that people have that. There's a foundation. They know things, and maybe through part of what I'm doing, I'm reminding them of them. A big one for me, just as a quick aside that I think most people on the call could relate to, is I have this thing called my G5 list, and when I get really stressed out, I force myself to sit down and write down 5 things that I have gratitude for. Mm-hmm. It's one of my stress-busting
immediately mood shifting.
Yeah, it really does. And I did it out of necessity when we had that major power outage back in October. I wasn't coping really well with being without all the conveniences of electricity. And I realized that I'm a role model for a lot of people and that I really could do better. And so I just said, okay, this is not a lot of fun, but I bet you if I started thinking about what I'm thankful for, it would shift my head a little bit. And so I just said, all right, I'm going to write down 5 things that I have gratitude for, and bam, And, I actually came up with 7 pretty quickly.
It does.
And all of a sudden, I was in a completely different space. So.
And the worse your situation is, just the more you have to force yourself to brainstorm that longer list.
Yeah. I have a smile file, too. I have a huge file with all kinds of cartoons and funny stories in it. And sometimes what I'll do is I find myself flipping through that and saying, aha, there's a great Gilbert cartoon, there's a good Gary Larson cartoon, or whatever,
right. Yeah, you have to get that perspective too, that as much as we identify with work and we're so tied to the role we have at work, it's not our whole life. And that's the other thing I wanted to ask you is, we talked about, there's everyday opportunities to create meaningful influence, whether you're in the store or whether you're with your family or wherever you are. But the other thing I wanted just to touch on before we open it up to questions, because we have a few minutes at the end to do that. I would encourage you questions, please. Thinking about that while I'm asking this one is, how your personal leadership abilities and personal leadership behavior affects your own work-life fulfillment. For any of us, how can we understand how our own personal leadership behavior can affect our fulfillment factor?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a terrific question, and one of the points that I made earlier relative to the lessons that I've learned in the past year is the one that when I choose to see things from a leadership point of view, and again, I can't emphasize the correlation to living our values. I often refer to it, and I know in the book I refer to it as taking the high road, consistently doing what you know is the right thing, because what we knew to be right 20 years ago is probably still very right today, and what we knew to be wrong 20 years ago is still wrong. And so trying to do the right thing consistently, and the point that I made earlier is that in doing that, in choosing that, back to the idea of leadership as a choice, in choosing to think that way and operate that way, I have come to believe that it brings out more of my true capacity to be the person that I want to be, the person that I'm capable of being in any of my roles. And it also comes back to the idea of influence. In many ways, if I think of leadership in the context of a choice, part of that choice is about how do I choose to use my influence. And it can be positive influence, it could be negative influence.
And being your better self.
And that applies across the line, across those borders, or borders rather.
Right.
Lines.
And I think that, our relationships are even more fulfilling when we're just showing up as our better selves.
Yeah, I'm more fun to hang out with.
I know, right?
My daughter would tell you that.
I know.
My wife, too.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm a lot more fun to hang out with when I'm in that zone, But I'm human, for any of you on the call that have read the book, I talk about being all of those behaviors, navigating is just one of them, but there are others. There's the victim and the critic and the bystander.
Yeah.
And because I'm human, I've been all of them, and occasionally I revert back to those others. I'm just trying to get better at it, but I'm okay with it because it's called being human.
Exactly. So I'm gonna jump in and just ask if anybody has any questions, for David. He's certainly been around the block in terms of dealing with, these issues we were talking about in leadership in the work world and even related issues. Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, please, questions. I invite questions on any of this.
Hi, I have a question. This is Christine Brooks. And my question is, I feel that this leadership mentality or attitude or approach to living your life is really so lacking in so many people, especially people looking for work these days who are feeling a lack of confidence and a lack of value from being out of work for a long time. And just as workers, sometimes they go into doing their jobs and are not really fully accessing their own highest potential by not seeing themselves as leaders. And I just wish that these techniques and this attitude was somehow kind of being conveyed more to not just what we consider the leaders, the CEOs and of the companies, but more to everyone needs to take ownership more for for themselves, for really striving to be the best that they can. Do they have any leadership programs in companies that you've seen, David, on developing employees, like a sense of ownership, a sense of responsibility, helping them to tap into their own ability to be leaders, even as workers?
It's a great question, Christine. Thank you for asking. Thank you for being part of the call. Yes, I'll answer the second part of your question first. Yes, I have seen organizations, clients, in fact, after the interest or with a client's expressed interest a couple of years ago, to this exact point, I developed a program entitled Discovering the Leader in You. And the idea was within this organization, and I've now done this at other organizations, the thinking was that everybody has the capacity. It's been my thinking, too, for a long time. Everyone has the capacity to be a leader. Again, it's not just limited to our job title, and it starts with us thinking that and accepting that and taking ownership of it, to your point. But I think back to the first part of the question, how do we live that? How do we recognize that? How does that apply to someone, let's say, as your example referenced, in transition? I think it's important to acknowledge that the feelings, the experiences, or maybe the feelings more than anything, that we all experience that contradict that choice, that get in the way of that choice, are normal and they're real. I call them part of our negative self-talk. And there's an example that I think is worth sharing, and it's a reference in the book. And I'd like everybody to just for a second write down WMIS AM and FM. Again, WMIS AM and FM. It has nothing to do with the television station or radio. It's rather a question. And the WMIS is, what's my internal screen? And that's where my head is at the first thing in the morning. When I wake up, I have this screen that plays in my head. Here's how my day is going to go, et cetera, et cetera. We all have it. It's part of our self-talk. And the AM is the appreciation mode, and the FM is the fear mode. And so it's a question that we all need to ask ourselves more frequently, including myself, particularly when I'm shrinking on that path of scarcity mentality or fear, because those are normal, real feelings. I experience them too, and I'm pretty motivated and fired up about the work I do. I know it's my life's purpose, and I'm deeply grateful for it. But I think all of us have an opportunity to be reminded of that. I think the gratitude piece is really powerful. We choose to show up the way we do, and it starts with our internal screen and how we feed our head. And those feelings of fear and all of that, the FMO, they're normal. They're okay. I suspect we can learn something from them. But the truth of the matter is each and every one of us is a brilliantly gifted, talented human being that's unique, and every one of us has the capacity to be in a different place and have some joy in the things that we call work and life. I'm deeply convinced by that, and I think that every one of us can examine that. It's something that's a daily process for me, or an ongoing process for me. So I think it starts there, Christine, and I think everyone hopefully can relate to that. But also back to the idea of the choice. Was that helpful? Yeah. Anyone else? I don't know how much time we have left, Jill, but I'm happy to take a few more questions.
We have a couple minutes for maybe one more question, possibly two, depending on the length. Anybody else have any questions for David?
Hi, this is Holly Winters.
Hi, Holly.
I wanted to ask you about providing leadership through change. In particular, when that means going through a reorganization or a downsize. It, to me, is one of the toughest moments for leaders. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about the soulful leader and how he or she handles that kind of a transition.
Thank you. I'll mention two things quick. One, you can also see on the newsletter and on the website, there's a new change, leading organizational change from the top down. It's a new case study of mine that just got published in the first of this month. Please feel free to request a free copy. It has a great outline of what I'm about to tell you. But I think from that perspective, what they do consistently is they're open to ideas, they're open to feedback, they're okay with not having all the answers. They make sure that there's clear and consistent and frequent communication that's coming from all the leadership ranks. The leaders have a clear sense of what they're dealing with. They communicate that. Referenced in that case study are the three common questions that people ask during organizational change, and this is based on a national study. The first is what's happening, the second is why is it happening, and the third is how do we need to respond. And leaders consistently have the same answer to that. They've thought that through. It's reflective of what the culture is and what they are trying to create. It's frequent communication, and they're mindful of those things and acknowledging, I think, as part of all of that, hopefully as a motivation, the human side of the equation. It's a fact. There's lots of research on the number of people that are on board with change, and conventional thinking in that regard is that on average, depending on the size of the organization, 20 to 25% of your population will be on board with it. They'll be your change agents. 25% will dig in their heels and will never change, and 50% will be on the fence. And the common denominator of getting people off the fence is good leadership. And I think it's a critical opportunity. I really think of it in the context of the leadership opportunity during change, to acknowledge let's look at what we're doing to help people off the fence, to support them, to acknowledge that everybody goes through the change cycle in their own way. There's no perfect timeline on it. Everybody is different. So it's being mindful of those things. It's not just checking it off the list. That's one of the most common obstacles that I see that people get into the organizational change. I've done a lot of work in this area over the years, and a big problem that I see is people in the check it off the list mode. And also or they relegate it or delegate it to HR only, and that's the story behind this case study, the critical importance of executive sponsorship. Those are some of the things that come to mind.
Great, thank you.
Awesome.
I encourage you to get a copy of the case study. It outlines just about everything I just shared with you.
So I can just email for that, or?
Yeah, if you look on the website, workchoicesolutions.com, there's a reference to it. If you look at the new newsletter that came out today, that's also under Learning Resources on the website. There is under Learning Resources, there is a link to click on to order a free copy or to request a free copy of the case study. It's also featured